and welcome to this episode of Art Sibley in Conversation. My name is Diane Collin. I am a woman with short hair, blue eyes, and glasses, and today I wear a black top. Behind me are an electronic piano and white shelves with books. This series presents artists, academics, and project leaders who dedicate their time and energy to a better accessibility for people with disabilities in the arts. You can find more of these conversations on our website, artsably.com, which is spelled artsably.com. Today, Art Sibley is in conversation with Christine Maitland, who is a storyteller, a singer, a dancer, a photographer, and a public speaker. You can find the resources mentioned by Christine Maitland during this episode on Art Sibley's website in the blog section.
Your touch was kissed by a sea and mist tenderly. I can't forget how two hearts met breathlessly. Your arms open wide and closed me inside. You took my lips, you took my love so tenderly. You took my lips, you took my love so tenderly. Thank you, Stephen.
Welcome to this new episode of Art Sibley in Conversation. Today I am with Christine Maitland, who is a storyteller, a singer, a dancer, a photographer, and also a public speaker. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you. I do appreciate that.
So you have a rich artistic life, but I think it started with the storytelling. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background? And also, if possible, can you provide a visual description? Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Christine Maitland. My pronouns are she, her. I am a black bisexual plus size woman with my hair cut short in a short afro. I am wearing a black t-shirt and olive green linen pants. The latter are not in view. Behind me are the closed doors to my kitchen, painted cream. In terms of a little bit more about me, I was originally diagnosed as a child as autistic and then diagnosed in my 20s as having ADHD before receiving my most recent diagnosis as being bipolar. Personally, I view myself as being on the spectrum of the first two. A little bit about my sort of artistic practice. I am a singer performer of jazz, soul, R&B, as well as folk, Americana, medieval, and Renaissance music. I am also a dancer with a background in ballroom, Latin, and swing, with training in ballet as a child and some knowledge of belly dance and Renaissance dance. I teach rhythm and motion and movement. I am also, I've been a writer since the 90s and a researcher in mainly of Black history. I am known for making TV and radio appearances, mainly because I'm a media hoe and I'm a photographer. Lastly, I live in Takaranto in the traditional territory of the many nations, including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and live in a city that's now home to diverse nations, including the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. But while I am a Canadian, I recognize my heritage as being Guyanese and honor my mother, my female ancestors, including my grandmother, Carmen, my aunt, Margaret, and my great-great aunts.
How did it start, all this attraction to the arts in your family?
My mother, definitely my mother. She was the one who took advantage of being in Toronto, my parents separated when I was 3, and my mother made the decision to stay in this country. She had come with my father from the West Indies, and then that didn't work out. And instead of going to the United States to live with my mother decided to stay here because she knew there were more options and opportunities, especially in the arts. So I went to the library regularly. I went to events at the U of T. My first introduction to Pocloïde Ludique Societas, which is a medieval theater company, was when I was 5. I took ballet starting at the age of 4, did that till I was 12, with a ballet instructor who was trained at the Bolshoi. And I did storytelling. My mother did storytelling with me when I was very little. So like I know my own family history, like to the nth degree. And she also collected children's books. So she would read to me. I mean, my mother is 50 now, not 50, I'm 50 plus. My mother is 80 and still reads children's books to me. So it's very much part of the culture. And even like when you look at my teens and in my 20s, my mother would take storytelling classes with me. I wasn't the type of kid who was like, "Oh, mom, why are you with me, mom?" That wasn't my style. I did things with my mother all the time and still do.
And so from storytelling, because her storytelling was for children, but if I understand correctly, you were more attracted in storytelling about lived experience or adulthood or things like that.
Well, actually, that's not totally accurate. My mother told the stories of our family. And then as I got older, I would find out more personal stories about the family and how I'd found out about my grandmother's participation in the World War II, I mean. Um, and then stories would be, for example, I lost my great aunt to 9/11 because she was a nurse and she died from the toxic dust from the two towers. So like these are all stories that play a part in our lives, and then so when it comes to my own storytelling, it depends on the venue. So I'm very active in the LGBTQ2 community. So those stories tend to be a little more, they can be a bit more erotic, they can be a little more explicit. Whereas if I'm telling stories of history, especially the Black history I do, then it will be, it won't be as much. So, it gauges. What I don't do is storytelling for children. I'm trained to do it. I worked for Toronto Public Libraries from 1988 to 1999. Um, I built 2 puppet shows for Toronto Public Library, but so I'm trained to do it, but it's not a favorite thing for me to do.
And this must have evolved into your Black history research.
Black history has always played a part in my life because my mother would tell me stories of Black history. But particularly Black history in the Caribbean, mainly because people don't talk about it much. So this is something I retain. But when I started university, I got involved with the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is a medieval slash Renaissance reenactment group that started in the 60s. My easy explanation of the SCA is it's a bunch of white guys who put on armor and bash each other's brain in with stick. that's that's simplistic, and I think I'd offend my friends in the SCA, but basically that's what it is. Um, but when I joined the SCA, the Ontario chapter had two black people in it, and I was one of them. And I had a friend, a musician, who was doing collecting um, Black history research, but he's a musician and tends to be a bit flighty. So I took the project away from him and I started collecting the data. And I still do.
Mhm.
Mainly, but I specifically about medieval and Renaissance history. That's my field, because in the 90s it was hard to find. You know, it's gotten easier now because, like, in the 90s we didn't have Google.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And even in the early aughts with Google, doing research still wasn't easy because we didn't have the keyword searches to be able to do that kind of work. And that has since changed, but in those days, it literally I was doing the work by hand.
In terms of history, you spend your whole life in Toronto, so you must have seen um, periods of evolution of how your research was perceived and how Black history evolved in the city.
It's still, I'll be honest, it's still problematic. Um, because like in the 90s, uh, yeah, I tried to sort of communicate with school boards and so on. I was ignored because I'm dealing with basically white academics. And then even in the SCA, it was a bit tenuous. People would question why I felt the need to do it. So that was an issue. Uh, and so it was a battle. These days, my issue is when dealing with academia, I have people who basically will lie to me and tell me that they're not doing the research that they're actually doing. I've had that happen a couple of times because everybody's like holding on to their research. Like, you've dealt with academics, you know what it's like.
Yep.
And when they're not, and especially when you're speaking to somebody who doesn't have three letters behind their name, I have a BA, I don't have a PhD, and therefore I don't have the cred, the street cred, when dealing with these people, even though 3/4 of the time I know more than they do.
Yeah, but we have this discussion about, okay, it's great to have a PhD. It shows that you did a lot of studies and spent a lot of time with academics. But okay, it's fine to have none, and it's fine to have a master. It's fine. It's all about what your motivation in life is and what you like to do. It's not
Mhm.
about it's important to have three letters.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I also feel, because the research is so accessible, the days of, being able to keep things locked away in a library, like an academic library, forget public, an academic library, who, unless you happen to have the library card, because you're a PhD and you can get you know, in the 90s, because I was a U of T grad and an alumna, I was able to get a library card. And then after a certain point, I had to pay for that privilege. You know,
I see.
these days, Toronto Public Library has access to JSTOR. It has access to like the major academic journals online. So I don't, I can just go online and look the stuff up. I mean, here's classic. When Toronto Public Library got hacked and the system went down, I happened to be speaking to a journalist from CTV and told them that I was flipping out because I couldn't access the JSTOR. JSTOR got in touch with me and gave me access directly.
Good.
So it's just like they recognize the importance of this stuff.
Speaking of that, speaking of journalists, you're also a writer, right? You're
Yes.
writing these. So what do you write?
Okay, so I started writing in actually, I first started writing in high school. I would do exposés, and then when I was in university, and more to the point, when I was just finishing it, I started writing for the Varsity, which is the school paper, the main paper for U of T. You may know the name Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein was the editor at the time. And so I would write, opinion pieces and so on. I also, that was the point where I started doing interviews. So I would interview I interviewed like a whole bunch of Canadian writers who were just starting their careers, like people like Guy Gavriel Kay, for example, and and now like they're like governor, uh, you know, governor general award winners, but I knew them at the beginning. So but my first like paid piece was thanks to Michelle Landsberg, who I met through my mother, through storytelling. That's how I got the gig. And she was the one who got me in with the Toronto Star. So my first piece was published there. Then I wrote for the Toronto Star. Toronto Star had a Afro-Canadian magazine that it had for a couple of years, and I wrote for them. And essentially my relationship with them was they would call me up and say, "Can you write an article on X?" And I would meet the individual, interview them, write the piece, get paid. I mean, that was pretty much it. So that was the sort of stuff I was doing as a writer. I must admit, because of COVID and everything else, I haven't really been writing much. I'm hoping to get back into the scene. Last piece I did was for Huffington Post, and it was an article on the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, who used to live next door to me. So and so it was sort of a conversation about the royal family and of the time versus Meghan Markle, who my mother met, by the by. you know, my family, these people come into our lives and in very weird ways.
I want to go back to singing. I know
Yes,
you're a jazz singer. You have a
among
beautiful
other things.
voice. Yeah,
Mhm.
among other things, but I heard some excerpt of jazz, so I was very,
Yes.
very happy. When did it start? When did you start singing?
Well, I sang in church because I was raised as a Roman Catholic. More specifically, I was raised as an Irish Roman Catholic. The church was mainly Irish. Go figure. But so I sang in church. But when I was my the church was actually Saint Cecilia's, which is the patron saint of music, and singing was very much a part of my early education, elementary school education. But one of the standouts during that time was there was a Canadian singer named Bobby Jimby. He sang part of Expo in Montreal in, what was it, 67? And there's this song called Canada. You know, Canada, notre pays, da 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 da, so on and so forth. So my school did a gig with him at Ontario Place, when Ontario Place was Ontario Place, in 1976. So like that was my first like big show thing, because it was like, I don't know, 200 kids singing with him, and we also appeared on television a couple of times and sang with him then. I didn't sing again actively until high school, because I went to Humberside Collegiate, which is also a very music oriented school. Um, and so I sang in girls' choir. And then after that, I was doing the medieval Renaissance stuff. I sang Sephardic music because it was easier than singing in Portuguese, as I discovered. And so I did a lot of that. So we're talking 14, 15, 16 century material. I have a knack for learning to sing phonetically. So I sing in about 8 different languages. There's certain languages I won't touch. Polish is one, Turkish is the other. Phonetically, it's just like, it's easier to sing in Mandarin. So, I did that. And then I started doing gigs where I'd be singing and doing jazz. So a lot of times it would be for um, festivals, concerts, that sort of thing. Particularly in the LGBTQ community, that's where I would sort of appear, sing, leave.
You sing with someone, right? You sing with a double bassist.
I, I, funny story with that. I talk to people. I have no problem. People say the Torontonians are sort of closed. Not true. They're just afraid of, either if they don't want to deal with you, they're going to have their headset on anyway. So I talk to people all the time, and I saw him with his double bass going up the stairs, and I raced up after him and I asked him, "Do you play jazz?" Because some of them do classical, right? And he says, "No, I do jazz." I said, "Would you be willing to partner with me?" He said, "Sure." Man did not know me from Adam. Did not know if I could sing. Knew squat. Turns out he was my next door neighbor.
Huh.
He literally lived around me. He doesn't anymore, but at the time he was literally living around the corner from my house. So we started doing stuff. Well, we started doing stuff together, and then COVID hit. We literally had done our first bookings, and then that was the end of that. So I've only performed with him once since, and that was last year.
What's his name?
Oh, Stephen Falk. Falk.
What are your performing spaces in Toronto?
I just recently, literally like a week ago, did a gig at the Painted Lady, which is sort of a club mainly for burlesque performers. So I joined up with them. I think it was Good Morning Goodbye, something like that. It was specifically for performers who identify as bisexual, or within that spectrum. So We did that show, and that went really well. Like the performers were ah amazing, absolutely amazing. So it was fun doing that, and I think it was fun having me there because a lot of time with those with burlesque shows, it's a lot of strip, 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 strip. With luck, you might get a drag king, which we did actually. He was amazing, but with me as a singer, it sort of broke things up. And in fact, that was the cool thing about the show is that we had an somebody who was a gymnast. We had strippers. We had everything, and we had me. So which broke it up quite nicely. I like variety shows. If you're going to be spending that kind of money to come to a show, good to get your bang for your buck.
You also added an extra artistic practice, which is photography.
Yes, that started with the cell phone. I actually I have another camera, but the cell phone's great because I can just take pictures. And I I like I take a lot of flora and fauna, but I don't take pictures of people because that's personal space. And then there's the legalities of getting permission to take the picture of them, and I don't want to be bothered with that. So, and I have friends who are photographers, I'll let them do that. But I'll take sort of more whimsical photographs. um like there was a picture I took in when I was in London of they were doing this weird project, and they were making a paper chain across a bridge, and there was a sign saying please donate stapler. I mean, it was so ridiculous, because their stapler had died. you so it's those sort of pictures I like to take. Sometimes graffiti, stuff that people have taped on walls, that sort of thing, sort of whimsy. Those are the
It,
sort of photos I like to take.
and it goes back to your storytelling, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
always tells a story in that.
yeah. It's a photo story, basically. The other thing I like to take are pictures of architecture. I like the forms of things, and Toronto has some great features that people don't really look at, mainly because they're either very high or it's I think we take them for granted. We've got stuff. We tend to have a lot of our architecture tends to be a bit brutalist, but at the same time, we've got sort of if you look at some of the old banks and so on, some of the carvings and so on are amazing, but we take them for granted.
It's interesting how in Toronto particularly, how they mix architecture. So they would have this old building in the middle of gigantic towers, and
Do
it
not get
creates
me
that.
started on that. It's the whole glass building thing is boring. you know, it's not creative at all. And I think, and especially one of the things that I keep on poking my politicians about is housing in the city. When I was about 6 or 7, they were going to build an Ontario housing complex apartment in my neighborhood. I live in Hyde Park. and everybody was freaking out because it was just like, it was a lot of NIMBY. They didn't want any of these poor people here and so on. And my mother, on the other hand, was like, look, you can build it, just make sure it looks like all the other buildings in the neighborhood. The point being is that you are where you live. And if you build a house or an apartment or whatever that is not to standard, then the people who live there will feel like they're not to standard. So these things, I take into account. And I if I was going to get into yet another thing, architecture is of interest to me. I'll hook up with Brad Pitt and we'll talk shop. Oh, he's a big architecture junkie. Who'da knew?
So what's the next step for you? What do you have? Do you have some projects in mind that you want to accomplish?
Actually, doing choreography would be cool. And the reason why I say that is because I've been watching a lot of dance on YouTube and Instagram and so on. Variety of styles, whether we're talking, that sort of hip hop freestyle that they seem to be doing now, West Coast swing, tango, ballroom, like variety. And what really drives me nuts is this feeling of necessity to do tricks instead of just dancing. The only person who seems to not be doing this whole tricks thing is Debbie Allen. Debbie Allen opened up a dance academy in California. I think it's California. And I've been watching her kids, and it's none of that stupid trick thing. And also, her kids aren't, these skinny minis. The variety in terms of size of the children who are dancing, race is not a factor. It's mainly Black kids, but not necessarily. I'd like to see, in terms of the dance world, a wider scope. And so I've been thinking about how, what I would put together, how I would, attract people to do the dancing with me, or do it individually. I'm still sort of up in the air.
I see.
Lots of
Wow,
stuff.
that's a lot of things. Yeah.
Typical.
I have a question about working in environments where we promote accessibility in the arts.
Mm.
Uh, do you think about that a lot? How
Oh,
is
I
your
do all the
process
time.
about that?
I'll tell you. I and I've been doing this actually since I started doing stuff in the SCA, because I used to run events in the SCA, and that is that I scope venues, and it's amazing how many of them suck in terms of especially, you don't want to deal with the churches because you can't get in them. They're not accessible, and also I have to sort of, I think there are other things we have to take into account, like noise level, lighting. you know as I've gotten older and I've met people who have issues, especially my friends with children who are autistic, I've been sort of noting that there are all these sort of issues with sensory, and it's a question of how do we work with that. These are all the things. How do we? I've seen efforts with doing, say, visual art with the blind. And how do we, like, how do we um be on the ball with dealing with disabilities when you come across them? But people aren't educated in this stuff. They have a vague notion, like they might know things like sign language. Here, sign language. I was at a Mayworks uh, event this year, and they had um, sign language interpretation available, except they had two interpreters. No, they didn't have two interpreters, they had three. And this confused everybody. They couldn't understand why the deaf person needed three interpreters. Two is normal because the interpreters need to have a break. But having three, why? It's because in sign language, or when you have interpreters, a lot of the time the interpreters are hearing, so they can't sign in dialect. That's how come they have the other interpreter who happens to be deaf. I happened to learn this watching a TV show. you know, but this is shit that most people don't know. And more to the point, they don't understand. They don't understand that sign language is done in different languages. Sign language in America and Canada is different from sign language in Australia or in UK. So it's just like most people are totally unaware. And then you have African Americans. They do their sign language differently. But most people don't know that.
I
This is your
never met
education.
I never met an ASL African American interpreter. So
Right.
how different is it from ASL?
They it's a dialect. It's an American dialect. I can't speak for Black ASL interpreters here. But from what I understand in the United States, especially with the Southerners, they have their own sign dialect. Because I've seen this with comedians in Australia and in the UK. There's a chick named Catherine who does signing for Adam Hills. Brilliant. In fact, she's more fun to watch than the comedian. But I gather with the African American sign, it has its own. It's not ASL. I forget. I think it's called BSL.
BSL is British Sign Language.
Right, but BASL.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
Huh, interesting. Well, I learned
Yeah.
something. I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
So I came across it watching a rap concert. Um, but again, how it works in performance versus how it works in general speech could be two different things. Not totally up with that, but I did come across it, and it's just like, as I say, there's so many variants.
Mhm. Accessibility in the arts, it's really something that really fascinates me because
Mm.
there are so many aspects of it. And when you start like really paying attention of the details of the ASL or the sign language interpreters, and then the ramps for wheelchair users to access
Oh,
stages, because most of the accessibility, when we talk accessibility with a theater, for example, they will say, "Oh yeah, no problem, we're accessible. We can host wheelchairs in the audience." Yeah, that's not what I meant. Are you
I
accessible to the performers?
yeah, this sort of not thinking with um theaters and so on, it just drives me up the wall. Or simple things like um, there's a new NIA, which is an arts venue for geared towards the Black community. It's lovely. It even has an elevator. It's too small. Like I'm conscious of the fact that if you have a person in one of those bigger driving
Scooter, yeah.
wheelchairs, there is no way in hell it's gonna get in here. I am not a small person. I can barely fit in this space. So it's like I find myself, this sort of haphazard let's put in an elevator, but they don't think about the type of elevator, and or they don't, thought isn't put into um washrooms. Because the thing I've noticed is that, okay, now we have the call to have uh gender accessible washrooms, so we have parity, but then they don't put in the wheelchair access. It's like because I've been using, non-gendered washrooms because I go to gay bars, you know. And I remember one gay bar, they used to write us and them, you know. But in terms of the accessibility, there isn't thought with that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Well, I have a last question for you, and it's about people who might have inspired you or motivated you in your career, in your life as a performer. If you had to think of one or two people who really counted in your career, who would it be and why?
Two. One, Nina Simone, uh, because she was a genius, and totally mad. Like, I mean, as a representative of somebody who had mental health issues, it was patently obvious. But at the same time, it wasn't like she was wrong. Like, I mean, she just didn't have the patience to put up with nonsense. So she had her moments when she would be a bit glitchy, but for me, she is tantamount to, like, I mean, she was also living in a time of political strife, and chose to speak up. So definitely Nina Simone. The other one is a little more personal, and that would be Odetta, because I met Odetta a year before she died. She did a concert at Hughes Room, and I just happened to snag a ticket. And I went to Hughes Room, and she did her performance, and she was ace. Her last song, I don't remember what it was. She had the entire audience singing along with her. And of course, me being me, I had to sing with gusto. And then we all applauded, yay, and so on. And then everybody went on their way. And me being a bit ballsy, I went up to her and I said, "Thank you very much for the performance." And she looked at me and she said, "Are you a professional?" And I said, "No." She looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Why?" And it was just like, and that was like, that was the point where, like, I mean, I had always seen myself as an amateur singer, but I mean, this is a woman who performed with all the greats, This is a woman who was on a show with Johnny Cash. I mean, she worked with all the big ones, and she took the time to sort of point to me and say you should be singing professionally. Who am I to argue?
She detected you in the audience, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
So yeah, those are the two.
Well, thank you again for this conversation.
Thank you.
And yeah, wish you all the best for all your projects. And yeah, see you around in the artistic scene.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.